So I've got with me Kareem. Myself, I'm Nick Phipps. So Kareem, how about you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yes, absolutely. So thanks, Nick, for the intro. My name is Kareem Seddik. I'm the CEO of Yallaplay Games. My professional background was actually engineering. So I've worked back in the US at Dell Computers, where I was seconded at Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon. So really my experience was in building very high scalability architectures. And there's a story about how we transitioned into gaming, especially monetization. But engineering at roots, and then got into the gaming industry about 8 years ago.
Cool. And so just a little bit about myself. I'm Nick Phipps. I'm the lead game designer at Ubisoft Abu Dhabi here. I've been here for 12 years doing mobile games pretty much the entire time. I originally started off with CSI and NCIS hidden object games, originally for Facebook and then moving across to mobile on that space. And then for the last 8 years I've been running Growtopia, which is a mobile MMORPG, social, and pretty much all the other letters involved as well. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself. So just to kick us off, how about Kareem, could you give us a little bit of an introduction from how you transitioned from that more technical side of things into games? So starting with Tarneeb and your original, that entry point.
Absolutely. So the story of us was initially we were an AI company at first. So we've built this AI that plays a game called Tarneeb. And we were very passionate. It was during the days of DeepMind building very, very smart chess players. And we were just excited about building a very, very smart AI. So we built an AI for a game called Tarneeb. So Tarneeb is a relatively popular Middle Eastern card game. And we launched a website, and we got tremendous amount of traction. But our AI was very optimized to be super smart. So our games, you go and you can play against this AI, and you can actually invite your friends. So it's a real-time multiplayer experience, and you can add this AI, and he can be your partner. So you can have a partner as an AI or as an opponent. And we monetized back then, and I laugh because it's the worst monetization strategy ever. By $20 per AI, you have to pay with a credit card to be our website. And then we noticed very quickly that this does not work, right? We have to really put our game design hats on, and the passion hats was just not working at all. So we launched Tarneeb, we had a lot of traction, and then we went to mobile. And then that's when we started noticing a couple of things. First of all, building a very, very smart AI that just defeats everybody isn't the best strategy. You want to maximize your retention, which means you actually want an AI that loses at the right time and then wins at the right time. There's a sweet spot for players. If you're always winning, players are frustrated and they leave. Everyone knows this. If you're always losing, it's a boring game and needs to leave. So this is when really Yallaplay was formed, which is about finding this, using AI technologies to really enhance fun or game player experience. And this is when we also started growing up and realizing, cool, we have to put our monetization hats on and start thinking, how do we convert this passion into revenue and dollars? So since then, it's been several million users, several million revenue. So it's been a large experience, and I'm happy to share this in today's talk.
Yeah. So from your side, you're coming from very much the AI side of it. From my side, I was coming from the very early gaming side of it, where we were looking at web gaming, and it was very much the transition for how do we take web gaming and bring it into mobile as mobile was picking up. And so I've sort of worked through CSI with the original Facebook ads model, and then moving into when we're going into mobile, you're starting to look into more of the IAPs and in-app purchases. And so we've slowly gone through a whole bunch of different trials and errors with that process until we came to Growtopia.
Yeah.
So we essentially went from originally a Facebook version, then through the transitions of what was it then, Flash, and as Flash slowly died out, how to transition those games into fully mobile versions of the same game while still trying to keep the game alive. And then into Growtopia, it's a game that was live for that entire time, and then I took it over about 8 years down the track. The game is now 12 years old, so it has a long history of players who have been in the game, and we've had to figure out how monetization has evolved, but our players are still the same we still have groups of players from those early days. So it's a very interesting challenge to work with an existing group of players and figure out how to not just create a new model, but also work with the players that you have and make sure that you're moving those players through those changes as well. You can't just change everything on them while things are running.
So basically the universe changed around you,
Yep.
the monetization methods changed, and you still have the same users over the years, and now you're trying to tell them, hey, adopt these new models, monetize them. Absolutely.
That's right. And so just moving on from there, what sort of strategies on your side have you seen working well for MENA, and how does that differ when you're talking with, you were talking originally about Tarnib and a very regional focused sort of approach to that game versus, let's say, Spades, which is a very US focused of a similar style of game. So how is that, and what sort of success works in MENA versus what works versus the US, let's say?
That's a great question. Some background here. So we built Tarnib, and it was for the Middle Eastern market. And then, similar to our expertise in real-time multiplayer card games, we built Spades for the US market, and that got picked up by Miniclip. So Miniclip was our publisher for the first couple of years of this game. And then we learned that, okay, the US and the Middle East are very, very different planets. They're not even the same world anymore. So monetization is very different. It's the same core loop, it's the same code, it's the same playbook, if you will, but your metrics are just completely different. Monetization is extremely different. Your CPI, LTV ratios like that, CAC, unit economics, completely different. So in the MENA region specifically, it was extremely challenging to turn $1 on classic user acquisition of mobile and then LTV, and you have to make revenue this way. We had to resort to influencer marketing, and there's no real playbook for that. It's not automated, there's no data, there's no analytics. I mean, you're just negotiating with influencers. Hey man, here's some money, bring me some users, and it was a very chaotic Wild West approach. But it was scalable, and we got a lot of use this way, and that worked for the Middle East. You go to the US, and then the scale is just way larger. It's way easier to attract users using digital methods. So classic user acquisition, spending on networks, Facebook, your Googles and whatnot, it just works that way. But also your LTV curves, your ROAS, your payback periods are all very different. So all the tremendous amount of data you collected in the Middle East doesn't really apply directly to the US. So you always find yourself in a learning curve every time you move to territory to territory. So I want to say the transition wasn't difficult technically and operationally, but it was definitely very difficult in terms of projections, your business, your forecasting, and all the metrics.
Yeah, and so these are both completely separate games and separate environments. And with Growtopia is a single server for the entire world. So we've had a similar kind of challenge where you have people from all over the world, but where you've got Tarnib has one set of data and you've got Spades has a second set of data. We now have to sort of figure out how that works on exactly the same server with exactly the same group of users, and be able to figure out how to adapt content that is specific to the players from a region without actually giving them their own exclusive game. And one way that we've found that does this quite well for like a global audience is to have sort of regional themed events. So you have something that's fairly focused on the local groups, but it's a short-term event. So we don't necessarily have a specific one running for the MENA directly, but one of the ones that has been incredibly successful is one that's based on an Indonesian focus group. So we have an event that's based around Indonesian culture and Indonesian themes. For 1 week a year, we celebrate the Indonesian culture specifically there. We have another one that celebrates a Mexican culture in May with Cinco de Mayo. And so we've been able to sort of celebrate each group without completely breaking the games apart. And that has allowed us to be able to focus specific time periods throughout the year that we celebrate each of those and make them feel heard and feel a part of our game. And it also helps us change the strategies for each of those events, the same way that you were talking about, where we can use the strategies that work for, say, MENA for the events that are focused towards the MENA region and more of Arabic cultures and that side of things, and then we can do a Southeast Asian focused one and change up the entire strategy for that event specifically, while keeping sort of the core game fairly stable without too much changes there.
I had a question, if you don't mind. Do the players know? Like, will the players in the US know of the Indonesian events?
Yes.
So, okay.
So that's the one thing that we've tried to make sure that we don't do, because everybody's in the same environment, in the same space together. So when we have an event that celebrates a culture, everybody celebrates that culture. So in a similar way that you might see Christmas and you don't celebrate Christmas, or you might see Chinese New Year and you don't celebrate Chinese New Year, but you can join with the people who are and help them celebrate their culture. And it sort of works as, it helps us use the very, very specific differences that those cultures use on the monetizations and on the different gameplay data side, but it also helps us to sort of share their culture with the rest of the players. And so our players really enjoy being able to celebrate alongside someone else and enjoy a bit of their culture and learn their culture as well. So it's a bit of fun on both sides, not just a pure data thing. Yeah.
That's good to know. That was a very political question, but you got it.
And you did mention a little bit about working with local influencers. Could you sort of expand on a little bit more on that topic of how you go about that, working with the influencers?
Yeah. So I think, without spending too much time on this, but influencers, they come in all shapes and sizes, if you will. So you have your micro-influencers and you have like your mega larger celebrities, if you will. And they all require different, I don't say the word treatment, but they're very different beasts. So with your micro-influencers, they're more passionate, they're starting their careers in the influencing space, they have a lot more energy, and they're obviously less expensive. So and then your more expensive, larger influencers, just have large audiences, but a large audience or of a following does not necessarily mean better success for your game. So I think it's like really, I would advise going after several micro-influencers rather than like one large one. But again, it's really a depends question, depends on the alignment of your audience with an influencer, and of course all about the data. I think data today is a lot better than we were last time, so it's almost easier to collect engagement metrics from influencers and figure out, all right, who's working, who's not.
Yeah. And like we've found similar sort of things when we're talking about like the lifetime of our players. We've found that those influencers can tend to be better at bringing back churned users, and so we found that like you can use influencers as a way to bring back communities that may have dropped off and not heard about something, but they still keep following the influencers that they love. And so you can use that as a outreach to users that may have left your game, and you can bring them back through those influencers. So that's one of the areas that we found they can be very helpful, and you can sort of bring a far higher return from an influencer who has a group of players who used to play years ago. You bring in something new, particularly if you've got like regional influencers. For like our Indonesian event that I mentioned, we bring in one of our big Indonesian YouTubers, and he then promotes the Indonesian aspects in Bahasa in a localized format that all of his viewers understand, and so it helps to sort of expand that as well.
Actually, that's great and insights there. So something we learned from other studios I've spoken to is they would use influencers just to get their face on videos, and then use these videos as creatives to fuel their user acquisition. So not really primarily interested in that influencer's following or base, but it's more of having that creative content to use to fuel your UA. That's another way of kind of doing two things, hitting two birds with one stone, I guess. So
yeah, it can be really useful in that sense. And just sort of transitioning from that influencer user acquisition side of things to sort of a bit more of a monetization side of things. How do you actually balance that in, say, Tarnib with your AI? How do you balance your user experience with your monetization?
Yeah, we could spend hours on that one, but I think it's a trade-off, right? At the end of the day, so monetization. So our games are evergreen games, so we're always thinking long-term. We don't want to be too aggressive with monetization early on, because it always feels like if you're too aggressive monetization, it means you're trying to create too much scarcity in economies or too much friction in your game, paywalls or whatnot, and then that affects your retention. The other approach is, let's just focus on retention. That's your primary KPI, and then figure out, okay, cool, I'm going to have long retentions. How do I subtly extract revenue over time? However, that impacts your ROAS curve. So now your LTV curves are very, very extended, very long tail. So I think it's a trade-off, and I have to admit we've gone in both extremes, where we're like, all right, we need to make maximum money by day 3, right? And then push everything in their face. I don't care if this user leaves us. But that was not a good strategy. And there's another strategy of like, keep it super smooth, euphoric, everyone's super happy, retain users for 10 years, and then you try to monetize them and then they churn 3 months later. But as a business, that's not the most ideal, because there's a cost of money, there's finances and stuff like that. So next thing you know, my ROAS grows extended. So what's the point of having a very high DAO if my LTV is just very, very extended? So I think it's a trade-off, and I think this is where AI or like deep data analytics can really help you optimize that and also segment it. So today we're running a hybrid approach. So depending on the type of user we're acquiring, they actually have a slightly different experience within the same game. And that's kind of our way of just getting the best of both worlds.
So you're essentially using your AI to adapt to where your players' progression and their lifetime is along their progression and their journey. That's pretty cool.
What about Growtopia? I'm sure.
Well, yeah, Growtopia is sort of like on the opposite end of that, with a very, very long lifetime for users. And so we have the opposite, where we have a lot less of the focus on the early game side of things. And so most of our focus tends to go towards the late game side of things, which in itself can be a risky strategy, because it makes new user acquisition and new user flow quite difficult, because the further along, if I'm targeting someone who's got 7, 8 years of seniority in my game, how do I keep the game interesting for both my player who's been here forever and my player who's been here for 2 days, without essentially either making my old player really mad because I'm telling him everything he already knows, or making my new player have no idea what's going on because they're dumped into 8 years of stuff that they have no idea about. So we found it a very tricky side of things. And one of the interesting things with Growtopia is that it's got a player-driven economy. So it's not an economy that we have a whole lot of control on. Most of our control comes in how we introduce new things to the economy, as opposed to us effectively setting a price. So we put something into the game, and then the players are the one who choose what the value of that item is, which adds a whole nother layer of complexity to how do I monetize something that effectively has no value. Or I can't actually tell you what its value is, because its value is anywhere between $0 and $10,000. And that is purely based on what the player actually decided they wanted, or based on how much of that item exists in the economy or how much it's traded. So it's one of those really challenging things to balance out content that's already in the economy, and to encourage the old players to transfer that old content to our new players, to sort of bridge that gap from a user that has no experience. How can an older user give them the things that they need to catch them up to where the current progression of the game is? So yeah, it's a massive challenge that we have here, and it's one that we've had several different solutions to. And one of the sort of hidden benefits to having such a backlog of information and data is that we can very easily track what has happened. So sometimes when you're coming into a challenge and you're trying to figure out how to solve that challenge, you're trying to find a nearest neighbor, so to speak, so you can sort of get a rough idea of how it's going to look. But because we've been running the game for so long, we can essentially pull the data from the previous time something was running or from another event that's very similar, and we can very, very accurately sort of plan out how that will look with whatever the changes between the previous version and this version. So it allows us to very accurately target what we want to change. And probably the biggest part as far as making sure that that data is valid is making sure that we don't do too much at the same time. So we don't want to introduce drastic changes all at once. So we will, even if it might be great for monetization on one event, we might only do one thing and then save the other idea for the next feature. So we very carefully choose which monetization feature to test at which time, so that we have as clean data on whether that is actually successful. And that also lets us make very small tweaks regularly and release similar versions of the same idea or the same theory while making tweaks on it. And so we can very fine-tune that over a long period of time.
I had a question for you. In terms of monetization, are you sometimes afraid of monetizing too aggressively? Let's say in December, because then you get this hangover effect where in January you've kind of extracted maximum dollars from the users, so then your revenue drops in January. Is this something you actively think about?
So I would try to avoid having multiple things releasing back to back. So I want to always have something that has a monetization element attached to it, and then I want to give the players a little bit of a break to rest and to do something else. One benefit Growtopia has is it has 1,000 different things going on. So I can very easily switch and focus on something completely different. So I can focus on players with a big event that everybody participates in, and then I can potentially try something sort of hidden on the side with a very, very focused group of players. So for example, we have like a surgery feature where you can become a surgeon and go help people perform surgeries on them. I can make a tweak on that side to test a theory that I want to do in the next event. So I can push something into that feature that only a small group of players are playing regularly and actively. I can test my data and then I can throw it into one of the bigger events to see it working on a broader scale. So yeah, that's sort of how we stagger it. So it's not necessarily that we want to stop everything to have that rest, but we transfer that rest around the game.
Gotcha.
So not everybody does everything all at once, and we can sort of give players a break in one system, and potentially that can encourage them to move around to other systems they haven't touched in a while. So it can build that variety element as well. So even if they're not necessarily playing the system that we're doing something new in, it might bring them more variety, or it might just give us a smaller data pool so we can test something a little bit more accurately. Yeah.
Honestly, hearing you speak with all the complexity is making my hair even more white. So kudos to you for all this.
Yes. It's very much that side, isn't it? And I guess moving on to the same thing with player feedback, it's something that we're constantly collecting data from. So I guess on your side, your AI is also collecting a huge amount of data. So
Yeah.
where do you draw that line between like what the players are saying and what the data is saying?
You know, it's a great question. We've always aspired to kind of the, I guess, the American way of doing things, which is surveys, right? Surveys all the time. Ask people, hey, what do you like? What do you want to do? Customer feedback, customer voice, all that stuff. But the truth is, I think when it comes to games, most customers, well, you can get some valuable feedback. Sometimes the data speaks otherwise. So actually, the data always speaks otherwise. So and an example for us is just session length and game length. So in the game of Tarnib and Spades, you can choose the length of the game, number of points you have to win. So we experimented with very, very short game lengths because we thought, that speeds up your loop, allows you to make more money. And then we experimented with very, very long game lengths because that's what the players wanted. And a very long game, to put it in context, so our average game length would be, let's say, 7 minutes for a short game. A long game can last an hour. So people want to play the hour game. And we're like, cool, let's listen to them. We tested that. And then you're just not making any money. People are leaving and you're draining batteries, So it didn't work. So that's an example of us honestly having to A/B tests and then just listen to what the data is saying. But of course, augment it with some, actual customer voice feedback to hear it.
Yeah. And like Growtopia is a perfect example of players, because there's so many different groups of players. We can very regularly have one player that says, I love this feature, one player that says, yeah, this feature was meh, and one player that actively says, like, no, this feature is absolutely the worst and destroys the game.
Yep.
And this feature is identical. The exact same comment in all three categories. And so it's very important that you don't just take sort of the raw comments from the player, but you then go and use your data to try and evaluate how representative it is of the global community. Because while you might have a bunch of players talking, that player base that's talking might be only that one tiny % that is very, very vocal, as opposed to 99% of the players who were very happy with something but didn't bother saying it because they were too busy playing.
Yeah. Exactly. It's normally the minorities that have the biggest voice, it seems, in the games, or at least the most engaged. So you really have to look at the data and put it into context and perspective before acting on it.
Yeah.
So.
And do you directly plug those data into your AI system, or are you manually reviewing that and trying to sort of interpret that data yourself?
So I don't want to overuse the word AI because it makes it sound like there's an AI running our company. So we'll tone it down. We have specific modular AIs in different areas, like our NPCs and AI and whatnot. But the entire system is a blend of everything. So a lot of data analytics, a lot of regression models, a lot of probabilistic stuff, a lot of honestly, hey guys, let's flip a coin and figure out what we're going to do next. So. But an insane number of A/B tests. I mean, I think we're very good at just running an insane number of A/B tests here. So I think it's a culmination of all these things together that somehow start pointing the needle in some direction of true north, and you start noticing this trend towards that, and then that's how we sort of align our direction. But I hope that answers the question in the most vague possible way.
Yes, it does. I mean, one of the big things from my side is that translation of data can be very, very challenging.
Yeah.
And I have a perfect example of one event that we did, and our data analyst team and all of our reports were all saying this is exactly what we want. And I call this one the humble blueberry in our game situation, because Growtopia, everything grows on trees, and one of the first things that you get in the game is the blueberry. And so everybody who starts the game gets a blueberry. And we got a data report saying that there was one of our features that was like, this is the feature that we need to use. Like, everybody uses this feature. Everybody's playing it. Like 90% of our players have touched this, and let's say like 50% of our players are using it on a regular basis. This is the one point that we need to start focusing on and really test out this feature. And so when your data is saying this is the place we've got to go, let's go there. It's obviously like that's got to be a thing, right? And what was happening in the background is that data was being filled in with blueberries. Everybody touched a blueberry. And so they were counted as being a participant in that feature because the blueberry was used in that feature. And so it was like we need to be super careful about using just raw data or just pure player feedback. Like, you need to really understand the details of how you're collecting that data, and when you get those mistakes, it can be really like damaging if you don't understand what that mistake is. And that was kind of one of those reasons I wanted to see how the AI is using that, because if you're not interpreting it and feeding that information back into the machine, if it's purely taking a raw data set and trying to plug it directly in, you can end up with these same sort of issues where it says, well, everybody's doing this thing.
Yeah.
And it was correct. Like, when we looked at the data for the actual feature, everybody who played that feature was actively playing that feature. But instead of that feature being 50% of our players, that feature was 1% of our players. And 99% of those players were playing it very, very aggressively.
Yeah.
But when you're estimating based on 50% instead of 1%, your estimations are like completely blown out of the water.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's a crazy world. Looking at data and just trying to make sense of it. I'm sure a lot of us here has gone through that. There's this thing, I guess I like to call, I'm sure it's a real thing, like the poison pill effect. So you do like one bad feature in your game and it contaminates your data, and then now you just keep building on top of this, and then you almost have to go back in time and figure out, what's that mistake that I did that's making everything behave this way. So it's always finding, and then there's this other piece of it, which is you start questioning your own sanity. When we run the data and we're like, I'm 100% sure people are going to love this feature, and it comes out like completely opposite. So I think it's a mix of data, common sense, internal, and then also sometimes like asking people. I sometimes literally, when we're just stuck, lost in this world, I would call up my brother. He's like, gamer. Hey man, what do you think of this feature we're launching? It's awesome. He's like, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. It's like, thank you. So that's like one data point. But data's everywhere. It's not just the users, it's the players, perception, and QA. So put it all together.
I mean, that's one of the things I love, just bouncing ideas off the other designers.
Yeah.
Like, once you think you know what you're doing and you think it's right, just go and ask someone else in the team. Like, so many times they'll just be like, why? What are you doing? Like, because you can get so stuck in the weeds of, this is what we're gonna do and it's right. Having someone coming from outside and just questioning the, like, really? What were you thinking here? Can be very helpful.
Absolutely.
So just going a bit outside of that and beyond the player feedback side of it, how do you go and like explore alternate revenue streams, not just inside your game? Do you guys sort of have any external or additional revenue streams going for your stuff?
It's a good question. So just for some context, we're a hybrid monetization model, so in-app purchase and ads. So they're keeping us very busy already. I feel like you're running two separate businesses per game, but we've always heard of web payments, right? And it's something that we've actually, when we first started, we were only web, so we have some experience there, and we have some parallel competition studios doing pretty well on web. So north of 20-30% of the revenue is actually on web payments. Those are interesting, especially if you're an in-app purchase heavy game, because you obviously save on the store fees, the 30% Apple fees. But I feel that depending on the game, that could be a high production cost. So in our case, we felt that we actually have to build a whole new HTML5 web version of the game to capitalize on this. Some other games is just a simple, hey, here's a link to our website, you can buy stuff there. But of course you have to be very careful because you're maneuvering through Apple and Google's regulatory sort of landmines. But there's that. So there's web payments, and there's like subscription models, so which is something we've done on one of our games, not the other one. And then there's like offer walls. So there's other ways outside of in-app and just ads. But for us, that seems like just already enough to chew on.
Yeah.
What about yourself?
So for Growtopia, we found that each of the different payment methods tends to work completely differently. So we found that you can't necessarily treat them all as the same thing. So we have a ridiculous number of different payment options and different web shops and in-app purchases and offer walls and ad monetizations and everything under the sun. And what we found is that some of them work in specific regions very well, or some of them work very specific to packs. So almost going back to your thing at the start of different demographics working with completely different monetization models, we found that each of the different payment methods sort of function in a similar way to segment different groups apart. And so we've been able to sort of utilize that to focus on certain things in different stores. And you are very, very right. It is a lot of work to maintain. I think I'm maintaining somewhere around 9 or 10 different stores, each with different ways of operating. So just
more white hair, man. Just
yeah. But what that does let us do is, in areas where we tend to not get any monetization, we have quite a large group in Southeast Asia that typically won't monetize through normal payment options in, let's say, normal for the US. But through some of the web shops, they allow different payment methods with, like, mobile phone. We've got global, and we've got Etisalat in areas you can pay with your phone. So by using those different payment providers and different options, we're able to monetize different groups in different ways. So one of our web shops works very, very good, very well with our our Battle Pass subscription model. It's very, very focused on that. It does sell some of the other stuff okay, but every time we do a new Battle Pass release, that payment provider specifically has a big spike and has a good monetization for the start of each of our seasons on the Battle Pass. And in reverse, we have things like the offer walls, where we're able to monetize the non-paying users in different areas. And so we're able to focus the different packs to different areas of the player experience as well, not just different regions, but also potentially your traditional free-to-play players. We can monetize them in areas that they would typically be looking at, instead of what you would normally see, where your big spenders would typically be your very senior players and your very big traditional whale sort of players. We're able to sort of focus each of the monetization options towards those different groups. So like we can have an ad, so like our offer wall is fairly focused towards like your free-to-play players who never pay, who never do anything, but you can almost monetize better on a player who doesn't pay you anything. And one of the reasons with the offer wall, it's a really interesting one, is back a couple of years ago, Facebook was like the be-all and end-all for advertising and for user acquisition, and then they lost the ability to track data for players, which completely tanked the ability to target specific users. And we found that the offer wall actually allows a similar kind of advertising and user acquisition, where they essentially flip the script. They give the player the option to tell the advertiser that I am the player you're looking for, by setting an objective to come into my game and play the game for 7 days, and I'll pay for that player because that's the kind of player I want. And so it allows some of those people who are looking for that very targeted, user acquisition, to focus on very specific groups of users. So it's been a really successful one for us outside of your traditional monetization areas. And the other thing that we found on that side is that it's a very long, sort of slow rolling system. So it's one that you don't instantly get everything at the same time, because it requires them to do something in the offer wall to get the payout. You end up having this slow progression of players coming in regularly, and it's sort of snowballing over a few months to sort of build and build and build. So yeah, it's one that you have to understand how each of those monetization systems work and not try to apply the same logic to all of them equally, which can be a complete mind shift and is not an easy task by anyone's means. So if you want to try and follow our example, do, but also understand that it is not an easy thing to do.
I think also something to caveat, Grow to Up is a huge game, so I think you have to also factor low-hanging fruit and then add more things. For example, carrier billing, something we experimented with, but it was towards the end of exhausting all the other channels, but carrier billing just had a massive fee over it, for example. So I think it's, it's something that really depends on your game as well. But I think eventually you want to maybe try everything just to see what gives you, maximum revenue, but it's interesting.
Yeah. What do we got here? So I guess jumping back over to you guys with the AI side of things, have you guys seen any strategies with like direct-to-consumer purchases with the web shops outside of just building your game there? Have you found any ways that you can use those, or is it sort of one that you guys just essentially dropped and weren't looking to jump into?
We have mixed feelings about it in general, because I have a general belief, and maybe we're jumping ahead here, but if you fast forward 10 years from today, I think the utility of the Apple Play and Google Play Store is actually diminishing, and I think 10 years from today, everything's going to be on the web, because it's cheaper, it's faster, it's less governance, it's just way easier to launch a game on the web. And so I think we're in the early stages of adoption of, or like, let's say going back to web, if you will. Why? Because the web technology is really improved today. So HTML5 10 years ago, it was Flash, right? Let's say 10 years ago was Flash. And that's the only way to build games, and they were very, very limited. There's no 3D engines and whatnot. Then you had a few plugins here and there, but now HTML5 is advancing so much you can actually build full-blown mobile games, high fidelity, or good enough, let's say, on web. And when that happens, the question becomes, why am I even on the App Store, right? Being on the App Store doesn't give me anything. It's cost me 30% of my revenue. I'm competing for rank, right? And I'm abiding by tons of policies, and it's not a fair, fair playing field anymore. If you look at the top grossing or the most successful games on the app stores today, whether it's Google Play or Apple, whoever's commanding the top 20 have been commanding it for the past 10 years or 5 years. So it's very clear to any new entrant that it's a very hard wall to climb if you're entering the app store. So some players such as Pokey or some other big publishers who are very focused on web, I think they're doing the right thing, because I think that's where the future is heading.
And I guess that sort of leads into the idea of cryptocurrencies and Web3 style currencies also being a part of that external ecosystem. Is that something that you guys are looking into with your projects?
Absolutely. So we've built a Web3 game as well, so we have some experience there. So as you mentioned, I'm going to take a step back. It's clear that monetization is becoming more and more competitive. CPIs are rising. Getting positive ROAS is becoming more and more difficult. So when you have extreme difficulty in the market with your classic monetization methods, you're fighting for cents, you're fighting for dollars, you're maximizing everything, you're using AI, you're like really squeezing. Once you get there, I feel there has to be like a breakout into a brand new way of monetization. So Web3, crypto is one of these breakouts. It's something new, it's something novel. Again, don't want to go too much into Web3, but yes, when that becomes easier to build a Web3 game and monetize it than to go build a free-to-play game, because we built a hybrid game actually that supports both monetization methods, but we divert resources to focusing on the Web3 part, because we're like, okay, that's easier. I can monetize a lot more that way, so let's just focus on that. So absolutely. Sometimes you have to think really outside the box to figure out how to monetize your content or game.
Yeah, and I guess it's an area that we've been looking into constantly, and my question always when it comes to those to new technologies, particularly with Web3, but anything new, is what exactly is it specifically bringing to the game? And it's one thing that Growtopia is almost the perfect game for it, because it already is that trading game, but it's always had the challenge of being a fairly young audience, and Web3 has predominantly required you to essentially be 21 minimum to have basic entry. And so it's always been the question of, this is a good thing for our game, but our players can't use it. And so it's always trying to find that right fit for the technology and make sure that the technology isn't just there for the sake of it.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I see regularly is people will try things but not have a good reason that it's actually going to be beneficial in the game, where you could potentially do the same thing with something a lot easier to implement.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's always a challenge when it comes to new technologies.
Actually, on that point, when I think of monetization, I mean, it's a full cycle. It's the user acquisition, and then you convert them. So for example, Telegram. There's a new wave of developers building apps for Telegram, just because user acquisition there is it's on its early stages, so you can get a ton of users by building a Telegram game. Now, it's not really a monetization discussion, but you end up making revenue just because your acquisition channel is just extremely cheap. So that's something also to think about as well. So it's a complete funnel, end-to-end as well.
And I guess that comes back to the thing you'd mentioned previously with the app stores being so saturated and having sort of these well-established titles at the very top. Going into a new market, those titles aren't currently present, and so it's essentially a
opportunity,
free game. You're no longer fighting against the big names that are currently at the top with millions of users. You're fighting against everyone at the same level. So yeah, it can be a fun experiment, but it's also a tricky one to jump into because it's that new environment, and so you're essentially diving in blind. You can't use that history of data. And every time we've jumped into one of these new models, new opportunities, it's always coming in blind. And so it's one thing that we tend to sort of try it, like dip our feet in, give it a shot, start collecting some information first. It's one that we don't ever sort of dive in 100%, especially not with Growtopia, because it's such a long-standing game, and so it's something that we're very careful about where the community is at any given time. We don't want to dump something completely new on top of them. We'll add it as an addition and say, hey, cool, you can start using this if you're available, and start testing the waters and see how it's looking. So yeah, that's something that we've done to try and test everything that comes up, give it a shot, see how we could use it and how it could be applied to our users, and give it a sort of a side test. So like your typical soft launch or soft release, we can do the same thing with an existing live game. You can do a soft launch, so to speak, where like let's take the web shops for example. We made them available in 1 or 2 countries just to see if people were going to actually use them. And we tried 2 or 3 different versions of it, different companies with different focuses in different areas. And we found one of them did absolutely nothing. Like, we were getting nothing at all. No one was going through it. Another one was doing a huge amount in very specific areas. And so it was just testing those waters and then slowly expanding them to the rest of the community. So wherever there is that opportunity to sort of try it on the side without it being a sort of integral part of things first, that's where I tend to lean when it comes to plugging things in directly.
Yeah.
I guess we can sort of, we're almost coming to the end.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any sort of closing remarks that you wanted to bring in from your side? Any sort of last sort of comments or points you wanted to come up and bring up?
No, thanks for that. I think we covered quite a bit. I think we should open it for, if you have any questions for us, we're happy to answer. But I think on that remark, it was our oracle prediction for the future of monetization. So for me, it was the web shops, or just the web becoming the Apple stores.
Yeah.
Did you have any future?
So from my side, I think it's more based around the offer wall side of things, that allows users to really target specific advertising, which is something that was very strong in the past, and we lost that ability, and now through the offer wall systems, that's starting to become reusable again. So I think that's sort of a new sort of avenue for very, very specific targeted user acquisition for some of those bigger titles. So I think that one's going to really take off fairly soon.
Yeah.
It is already taking off in some areas, so I think it's going to be a much more integral part of how you specifically focus on user acquisition in that sense.
Awesome.
So I've got a question about direct to consumer. Do you guys think it's going to take off first on this kind of web store side of things, or more on this kind of alternate store APK traffic? Because obviously those are the two forms of direct to consumer, and more the like kind of short term and then the medium long run. I'm kind of just wondering how you guys are predicting it going forward.
Yeah, so the question there is direct to consumer going to be through the traditional web shop that we see regularly now, or whether it's through an app, if I'm correct?
Through like alternate apps like APK downloads, which kind of need Google verification and whatnot, but you can still download it as an app.
Yeah. Do you want to start off from that one, or do you want me to?
So I feel like something similar happened on the PC side of things. So it was your Steam, and then you have your Epic, and then you have these other stores, and so I think there will be some breakout as well on web, mobile, where you have like these new entities coming in, trying to take on Apple and Google.
Yeah, I think sort of looking back at the Epic versus Apple sort of situations, it is going to start becoming more web shop, not web shop, sorry, more of those kind of additional stores like we've seen on PC, where once upon a time Steam was essentially king of all PC sales, digital sales, and we've slowly seen more and more different APKs in your example there coming into the PC side of things. So I think as more and more of the larger publishers start jumping into those spaces and filling and sort of trying to take a bit of Apple and Google's pie, we'll see more of those. But I think the website of it is so easy to integrate. I don't think that's going to necessarily disappear at the same time. I don't think it'll be either or. I think both are going to expand until the point that you'll sort of have far less focus on just your Google and your iOS side of things, and you'll have a lot more options available.
It's a good question.
Yeah. Do we have any additional questions? Yep.
When you were talking about influencer campaigns, and you used them for engagement mainly, and more not everything else, because you had groups that left and basically came back through influencer campaigns. Are we talking about influencers that are specifically for that game, since it's a long-running game? For
yes.
Your game? Okay, so these are influencers that are for your game, not, or basically their content revolves around your game.
Yeah, so that one, is the question specifically for Growtopia?
Growtopia.
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, were the influencers for Growtopia specific for existing Growtopia influencers, or is it asking?
No, I'm asking you, you said that you use them mainly for re-engagement campaigns to get you back the users that kind of dropped off or churned.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm asking you if these influencers are Growtopia influencers, that content is mainly Growtopia, or did you use other influencers who use similar games and they brought back your users?
So we've done both. We found that existing influencers that play the game tend to be more effective at selling the game itself, because they play the game and they know the game. We found when we try and bring in like influencers that have no knowledge of the game, it feels less genuine. And so it can work, but when we're talking about the reactivation campaigns, it's more focusing towards existing influencers. And when we're talking about the other side of it with essentially blind influencers, it's more trying to build up those influencers to the point that they can then be the existing user. So for the reactivations, it's very much focused around existing influencers who are either were previously doing stuff on our game or are currently doing stuff. So we might reach out to an influencer who hasn't played for a while and ask if they'd be willing to come back and do a session again for this specific event. Yeah, hope does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question. I asked this question because the way you two are looking at influencers are completely different. One is for user acquisition, and the other one is for reactivation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we've toyed with like having ambassadors, right, for the game. Those are influencers, but it just wasn't a low-hanging fruit, I think. But yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how each game can actually utilize those in very different ways as well. It's not just a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions? I think we've got time for maybe one more, or we're just about out of time.
I have a question towards the Web3 too. Do you find that is there a merit to having NFTs as a value that has actual value, a dollar value, plus a functionality in the game? We have like quite a few games like the Axie Infinity, they have millions of users, etc. Similar games. Do you think that could be a type of monetization,
So,
kind of inadvertently?
so the question is if NFTs are purely a trading commodity externally versus NFTs that actually are a functional element inside the game?
So as an NFT that has the both elements.
Yeah.
Because you know when you play a game, you buy a hero, you spend it. But that hero has no resale value.
Yeah.
But if that hero is an NFT, that it actually, even if you stop playing the game, it still has a resale value.
Yes.
So I can answer that because the game we've built, the guns in the game are all NFTs, and then you mint these guns and you have these guns and they have a certain value tied to them. And then the more you play with these guns, the more they level up. So the gun's inherent value will actually go up, and there's a store where you can actually go and sell that exact same gun that you bought for $2. You can maybe sell it later for $20-$30. But obviously you spent a lot of playtime hours to sort of evolve your gun to that level. So absolutely. But again, it's super experimental, it's super novel, it's super in this area where it's very hard to find many references in the space. And that obviously has its cons and pros.
Yeah, and from my side, when it comes to whether the NFT should have in-game function, I think a lot of it comes back to how is it traded outside of the game as well. You can't just consider an NFT as an in-game asset or as purely a trading asset externally as well. You need to consider both sides of it. And I think one of the best references I've seen for that kind of how to think about it is looking back to like your traditional collector style environment where you have these things that have function. Take your baseball or your sports memorabilia, where the memorabilia has some function in itself, but the collectible side of it doesn't necessarily require you to be able to play the sport to be able to trade the memorabilia. And in the same way, the actual function of the item doesn't require you to be able to trade it. They need to both function in their own independent way for it to work. You shouldn't be necessarily selling something that now I have to go and play the game for it to have value, or I have to be able to trade it for it to have value. So trying to make sure you are able to keep both as their exclusive elements while complementing each other. I think that's pretty much all the time that we have. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and then thank you, Kareem.
Thank you.
It's been
Thank you,
great
Nick.
chatting. So yeah,
Really
thanks
enjoyed
everyone.
this. Thank you guys. We did it. Yeah.